Well, that was anticlimactic with the board stopping there once it got past the in-feed roll. I'll make some adjustments and we'll try it again here in a little while. But that was the first time this planer's been used, probably in the last 8 or 10 years. I purchased it from a guy in the neighborhood who had developed a condition and was not able to do his woodworking anymore. So I've taken it and refurbished it and going to put it back into use. This is a Rockwell model 22-201 thickness planer. It's a wedge-bed design. And it was probably manufactured from at least the 1960s until sometime in the 1980s. This model has a 220-volt, 5-horsepower drive motor on the headstock. Under this cover, there's a separate 1/2 horsepower motor that drives a variable speed pulley system that runs a worm gear and a chain mechanism that drives the two feed wheels. One of the features of the 201 model is this table roller height adjustment. So the idea is if you're running real smooth stock through, you can set the table rollers flush with the table, or if you're running real rough stock, you can set them up to 40 thousandths above the table. The name Wedge-Bed comes from the mechanism by which the table is raised and lowered. There's a screw jack here and a large main wedge, and the table has a couple of wedges bolted to it, and the whole assembly is raised and lowered through this wedge mechanism. One of the variations available for this model planer was you could buy it with the motor mounted on this side. So it'd be a direct drive motor with a coupling through this opening here to the cutter head shaft. Part of my project with this planer was to replace the cutter head with a new spiral segmented insert cutter head, in addition to replacing the bearings. Another aspect of this project was to build a mobile base for this planer. These caster assemblies are welded out of 3/8 and 1/4 inch bar stock, and the casters have a 900-pound capacity. So that's my Rockwell 22-201 thickness planer. I'm going to spin through a few photos of the restoration process, and then we'll come back and try to plane this board down to thickness.
This planer was purchased in January of 2017 from a gentleman in my neighborhood who had purchased it new in 1976. It was never used commercially and was in pristine condition except for rust, and it had not been used in the past 8 to 10 years. To get it home, the motors, the main wedge, the bed wedges, and the bed were removed so we could tilt it onto a dolly and get it onto a trailer. It still weighed about 475 pounds. Here you can see the original planer base is just an open box with 2 cross ribs. In September of 27, I started disassembling it for refurbishing. 3 main goals were to fix the worm gear housing for the drive rollers so that it didn't leak, replace the cutter head bearings, put a new cutter head on it, and build a mobile base. Here you can see where the oil is leaked out from the worm gear housing and left streaks from the spinning pulley. The oil that was left had congealed into this pasty consistency. The original oil was a non-additive 600 weight oil that was subject to breakdown after time. I'll replace it with a modern synthetic. Rebuilding the worm gear housing was a challenge, so these photos help document its assembly. Most notable was difficulty in finding and installing a suitable oil seal located in the lower bore of the worm gear shaft. To do it again, I would take more time to build some tooling and rigging to squarely press the seal into place without damaging it. Most of the remaining disassembly was straightforward, involving various rigging, for example to press the cutter head bearings out of the frames. The cutter head bearings were very worn considering the light use the machine had received, so I'm thinking the left and right frames where the bearings are seated were misaligned and maybe caused the wear. With everything disassembled, individual parts were weighed, and the planer came in at 1,109 pounds, including the new mobile base. The mobile base started as wooden mock-ups to try some design consideration. Metal was purchased from a local metal supplier who cut the stock to pretty accurate sizes. It was made mostly from 3/8 and 1/4 inch bar stock. The planer's original base consists of 3/8 inch machine top with just 2 cross ribs welded across the centers, all welded to a 12 gauge skirt. It was supplied with 2 bars welded to across the bottom of the skirt to serve as floor mounts. To reinforce the planer's base to handle mobility, bar stock was welded between the 2 mounting bars and 2 cross braces were added. After repainting, the base and caster assemblies were put together. When the new Helix cutter head arrived, I found all dimensions to be accurate compared to the original. To press the bearings on to the new cutter head, a wooden block with a release shoulder was used. This looks a bit elaborate, but was very effective in pressing the bearings on without using any hammers. Once the bearings were pressed onto the cutter head, the pressure bar yokes were placed on the cutter head and the bearings pressed into their seats in the left and right frames using Loctite. During all this assembly, the front cross brace was installed to provide distance alignment between the left and right frames. However, once the bearings were in place, the front brace was removed, the left frame was loosened from the base and allowed to find its neutral location based on bearing alignment. Removing the front brace also allowed installation of the in-feed roll, the chip breaker, the outfeed pressure bar, and the outfeed roller. With the worm gear drive and outfeed roller installed, it was sealed with silicone gasket and filled with Amsoil SAE 250 synthetic gear lube. The wire harness was hooked up and new belts installed. The local Tractor Supply was much cheaper than the auto parts store for the belts. The main wedge was positioned, slid into place between the frames, and the crank installed. The planer's table was very rusty, but fortunately not pitted. A 50-50 solution of muriatic acid and water was sprayed on and allowed to sit for about 15 minutes. After that, the rust was literally rinsed away with a hose. Assembling the table to the machine was a bit of a challenge due to its weight and the assembly of the table rollers in the process. I was able to rig up some table rails to slide it into place. The left and right table wedges are clamped in place to accommodate the rail assembly. Once the table and rollers were put together and in position, the rails were removed and the table lowered into position and then adjusted for parallel to the cutter head. The table roller height rods, springs, and cams were installed and adjusted. And then carbide inserts were installed on the Helix cutter head. This model of cutter head requires 90 inserts. The in-feed and out-feed rollers were adjusted to the cutter head after the inserts were installed. And finally, the leveling pads were installed on the mobile base. It turns out the trouble I had with the first plank getting stuck was because the outfeed pressure bar was too low. I've made some adjustments, so let's see if it feeds any better now.